it may be a little easier if I tell you that what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different, not unrelated to, but quite different from what we've been talking about, at least what I've been talking about, some of the things we've been talking about up till now. A little bit of a change of pace. And I tell you exactly how it worked out. So when Bob first asked me to participate in this seminar, and then he asked me for tentative titles or titles of the 2 lectures I was going to give. So I thought about it for a day or so, and then sent him the titles. This was a few months ago, and then sometime later you sit down to actually prepare the material that you're going to do for the you're going to fill in what goes under the title, and frequently, well, always, what you end up preparing is quite different, in many ways unexpected, from when you pick the title, you only have a vague idea, and then when you sit down and you start putting it together, some other things come different. In this case, turned out quite different. So that the resemblance between my title and the actual detailed content is not going to be as close as it might otherwise be. So let me just put it this way. I said I use the title as an excuse to speak about maybe that and a couple of other things. So I'm going to begin with a discussion of this question of, indeed, why we repeat the mistakes of history. Because, I mean, that's a very simple question on its face. You examine it in a little more detail, it's a very, very complicated question to which there is no answer. And the question itself is quite ambiguous, because what exactly do we mean by mistakes, and how do you know about them, and so on. That's the problem. You see, once I got into it, then I realized there were all these layers of complexity. And so I ended up expounding on 2 other themes that are outside of the realm of economics as such, right? Economics or sociology or discipline, and are at a higher level, you might say meta-discipline, this thinking about thinking. And so there are a couple of things that, looking a little bit at methodology, right? What kinds of methods we use to study, looking at epistemology. How can we know what we know, particularly if we're policymakers, and morality, ethics. Sort of what is the interplay between action, facts, and values, right? And so I look at those. That takes me into a discussion of the context of social science, which is the context of complex phenomena. As I've already suggested to you, it's a complex adaptive system. So it ended up a lot more ambitious than I had intended. And that's the challenge that we face today. Although it's different, so maybe challenging, it's also the 3rd day of the conference. So take a deep breath, summon all the energy that you have, and maybe tune in as best as you can. So I'll start with something sort of more pedestrian, more simple, is to why we repeat the mistakes of history. And as I said last night, I began to think about this in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. And as I said, I was very surprised to find that everybody was very surprised. I mean, I remember very clearly that when the downturn came and there was this crisis on Wall Street, I didn't know how bad it was. But I remember thinking, it came. It sort of was not a surprise in the event. The pattern was sort of predicted. It confirmed some, fitted within my framework. And then little bit by little bit, the discussions, the talking heads that we say in English on television, and they started to, all of a sudden, these, I'm not just talking about people in the street. Yeah, you expect them to be surprised. But the so-called mavens, right? That's an American word, a maven, mavin. So they use the word maven. A maven is like somebody who, they like pretense of knowledge. They pretend they know. Everybody thinks they know. And they think they know. It's somebody, he's got, pushes out his chest. He's a maven. He knows about stuff. So these mavens sitting on television, And they're all like, oh yeah, too much regulation, how we didn't see this coming, and it was a big surprise to me that happened. And because why? Because to me it represented, and this is something that I want to state without debating, because I understand there can be differences of opinion about this, but at least to me this was an avoidable mistake. This was something that from my own experience shouldn't have happened. And so if I'm right, let's understand a big extent, but if I'm right, then how could we possibly explain such a thing if people did learn? So let me be a little bit more specific. I guess people can relate to things that are personal, even though it's maybe more anecdotal. So as I said, when I got out of the, when I had finished at the University of Chicago and ultimately arrived in Dallas, settled in to live the rest of my life, you know, I thought that there were certain things that were settled in macroeconomics in the sense that I could not imagine that there were many economists, if any, that would stand up at that time and argue in terms of the Phillips curve, argue in terms of a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You know, because that sort of seemed to be settled. It's one of those rare instances in social sciences where people do learn from mistakes and do form a consensus around the evidence just because the evidence is so compelling. I'll talk in a moment how the fact is that so-called evidence doesn't speak to us with one voice. But in that case, it was just very, very compelling, very powerful. You couldn't argue that we did not have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. You could not argue that this was not predicted by at least a couple of economists at the time. It revolutionized completely the way that people did macroeconomics. There was, soon after that, a turn in macroeconomics known as the rational expectations revolution, where because one of the explanations of why the trade-off between inflation and unemployment goes away is because, I don't really think it's such a great explanation, but in part at least it's correct, is that people sort of anticipate, they understand how the world works, they come to understand how the world works, they build that into their behavior, and then that negates the effectiveness of the policymakers. The effectiveness of the policy depends upon them not understanding, which is seen as an arbitrary assumption, because why, after all, should the economic agents have different information from the policymaker? I thought that was settled. Didn't matter if you were a Keynesian or a monetarist or something in between. The Keynesians sort of went a little bit off the stage. And if they were going to play a role in the macroeconomic debate, they always had to be careful to adhere to these new, well-understood principles of macroeconomics. So now you fast forward, suddenly 20 years, we get this crisis, it's all gone. Now all of a sudden people are bringing back the Phillips curve as though this never happened, as though nobody ever read Milton Friedman's role of monetary policy presidential address, and then all of the work that spawned after that, some of it quite technical. I know there was a lot of discussion about real business cycles and all that kind of thing, but sort of at a policy-making level, it just disappeared, and now we had, as I said last night, the recycling of discredited ideas. So that's sort of what motivated me, and that's a situation where I think we should have learned. It was an avoidable mistake, and why do we repeat the mistakes of history? It seems like I lost something. Yeah, there we go. So I have a number of related explanations, and I'm not offering this as a scientific theory. I'm offering this as one person's suggestion for some things explaining why it is that we may repeat the mistakes of history, based on sort of my own inferences. The first is something we've been discussing a lot. That's what we may call the ratchet effect of politics, right? So that's the idea that people who sort of get where they are because they've supported a certain point of view are much more reluctant to have that point of view disproved, right, by the facts. So, and the more there are of them, the more difficult it is to go back, right? So, if, for example, if tax reform is indicated by the evidence, but more and more people are going to be hurt by tax reform, then you can expect sort of that they will continue to try and resist it, even if it means making economic mistakes that we know that can be avoided at some other level. There's always the fact that the marketplace, I don't think the marketplace for ideas is a marketplace for truth. The marketplace for ideas is a marketplace for the ideas that have different values to different people. And there are all kinds of social strategies that we build up in order to support ideas regardless of their truth value. In the form, you know, the way we publish things, the way we talk about things, and so on. But that's another. So there's the whole ratchet effect of politics, part of the discipline of public choice. But then I think at another level, and this was also out of my personal experience, at another level there was this, this matter of memory. So the nature of memory. To put it in its simplest form, memory is a very imperfect interpreter of events, right? Of past events. History relies on memory, but it's very imperfect. And there are an enormous amount of intangibles. So if somebody maybe didn't make it to this morning's lecture because they overslept or something, and then they catch you later and they say, what did he talk about? You can tell them, right? But nobody really believes that it's the same thing as if they were here. You cannot duplicate in memory the experience. There's something qualitatively different from the experience of something than of the telling of something. So I think that there is a very close connection between that phenomenon and even the experience of history in a broader sense. So those people, for example, who lived through the Great Depression, regardless of the theories that were developed, they sort of what they learned were then codified, solidified in theories, and then transmitted down the generations. They find the theories compelling, but partly because they lived through it. They were there. And then comes along the next generation. They didn't live through the Great Depression, but they get told about the Great Depression by their parents who lived through it. And then the third generation get told about the Great Depression by the parents who didn't live through it, but their grandparents did. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, they're just reading about it in books. So because of the imperfections of memory, and because, of course, of the capacity of sort of transmitting different ideas and how they're related to one another, by the time you get down a few generations, there's the selection process, and then you find people talking about things that's why, you know, the older generation are sometimes very much surprised to hear the younger generation saying things that they knew were false a long time ago. And yet, so how come they don't know this? Well, they don't know this because they didn't experience it, nobody ever taught it to them, was selected out. But of course, that's inevitable. It seems like almost, you know, like when you bring up kids, when you bring up kids, you know, one of the sobering effects is that you know that they're going to have to go through all the painful lessons that you went through, because there's no way to avoid that, right? You can't tell them about it. You know that you can't sort of tell them this is what adolescence would be like if you didn't do this or that or the other. That's not going to happen. They're going to go through adolescence. They're going to have to make all the mistakes. So maybe as a society, you know, we have that at the social level as well. Maybe just it's unfortunately necessary that we continue in each couple of generations to make the same mistakes over and over again, hopefully as we stumble our way forward. So that imperfection of memory, I think, the nature of memory is a second explanation. The third explanation is more serious. Worries me a lot more, and that is we have systematically downgraded history in education. Certainly in the education of economics and in social science in general, but almost in all education. This is part of the division of labor, the increasing complexity of the human capital structure, if you like. The fact that basically we become more and more specialized, so as I said the other day, we know more and more about less and less. When I arrived at Chicago, it was the last year that the economic history requirement was, that there was a requirement for a PhD in economics. And ever since that time at Chicago, and it's the same in every other institution of higher learning, not every other, but the vast majority in economics and maybe in other related subjects, you don't have to study any history at all. You don't have to study any history of thought. You can get economics and you don't even have to study any economic history or the history of economic thought. And I guess most graduates will tell you, yeah, well, why do I need that? Because they're thinking of economics sort of as a technical subject, you know, like mechanics or engineering or whatever. If I know an idea works, I don't have to know who invented it or under what circumstances. But I think that that is a very narrow view that leads to bad economic policy, bad perception, precisely because of those incommunicable, intangible, contextual details that basically influence an understanding of the theory. Every theory is developed in a particular social context. And if you don't really understand that context or even make an attempt or even told that that's a valuable thing to do, you're not going to have as good an understanding. So we've had a systematic downgrading of the importance of history, not only actually at the college level, but at every level. In high school, we teach history in a perfunctory way in the United States. It's like, you know, you have to have it, but it's I say my students frequently, even at the graduate level, they have to have studied American history. But the way they studied American history was they memorized. You know, I think Israel is different because of the collective experience and the unique experience of Israel. In America, it should be like that because, you know, it's also, in a way, a society that was founded in sort of an experimental situation. But it's older, you know, it's the oldest republic. And they've lost the fire because the teachers that teach them the history don't have it. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why I think we just don't learn socially in a way that we can say build accumulation from before, in that we avoid certain mistakes that were made before. We seem doomed to repeat them. And that then brings me to the nature of social science itself, because you don't make them, and nobody in physics makes the mistake of thinking that the law of gravity doesn't work, right? There are certain things, certain kinds of sciences where you study, you get certain, you establish certain laws, certain regularities, and then these are established forever. And that is more in the nature of the social sciences and theory of complex phenomena rather than it is of anything else. This is something about which methodologists, that's another thing that economists avoid like the plague, trained economists, mainstream economists. They never discuss in any serious way the question of method, of methodology, of how you know what you know. That is given to them as certain dogmas. The dogma is basically, as I said to you the other day, it's a matter of what you can measure, of what you can verify, although it's dressed up in the notion of refutation, and I'll try and explain to you how that works. All within the context of what we call classical probability theory, or some other variant of but objective probability theory. And so the economists are not taught ever to question that. But at one time, this was very, very important, and Friedrich Hayek spent pretty much a large part of his career thinking about it. He was a friend, and this, because you may be a victim of the events or the turns that I've been talking about, you may not know this name, but maybe I'll just ask, how many of you know the name Karl Popper? Oh, wow. Well, so you're more educated than me. Okay. So Hayek's a younger friend. Those of you who don't know, I say, tell my class when I'm teaching them, I say, make 3 columns. Okay, in the first column, that's what you have to research now, because I've said it, and I'm expecting that you should know that, and you should feel some urgency to go and look at it now. Go now and find out that. The second column is that's you have to look up sometime during this course. And the third column, you put all sorts of things that you want to refer to when you get your life back, right? After you finish the degree. So Karl Popper is someone that everybody should know about, because Karl Popper established, it's the basis of Milton Friedman's idea of what he calls positive economics. It's actually, if you excuse the expression, it's actually a bastardization of Karl Popper's view of science. But Karl Popper was a younger friend of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek got him his job at the London School of Economics. And the two of them were very influential in talking about how you do science. And it was as a result of the influence of Karl Popper, actually, that Hayek developed a lot of his approach to social science. In particular, in the beginning, Hayek believed, in accordance with the teachings of his teacher, Ludwig von Mises, he believed that there was a fundamental distinction between social sciences and natural sciences. Okay, that what we call methodological dualism. Now, that distinction is very intuitive. It's because basically there's a categorical difference, not a matter of degree, but a complete categorical difference in the way that you approach the research. And the reason is quite simply subjectivism. Because in the natural sciences, it makes absolutely no sense to talk about intentions or motives or values. Values, yes, in the sense of trade-offs of whatever it is, whatever your objective is. But not values in terms of the agents in the model, which are molecules or forces or something. It doesn't make any sense. In economics and sociology, psychology, social psychology, political theory, you cannot avoid talking about motives, values, expectations, subjectives. So you're dealing in the realm of the intersubjective. And that is a categorical difference. Because these things are not things that you can put in a box and measure and trade around. So that was the sort of thinking, methodological dualism. That's precisely actually what the mainstream of economics denies, that there is such a thing as methodological dualism. They say that basically the methods of physics and the methods of the natural science are the methods of all science. It doesn't matter whether it's social science or anything else. So Hayek denied that. I haven't got time to go into a lot of detail about it. But one of the reasons is the nature of human perception and how human beings, studying human beings, how far you can get and what are the limitations. For example, there's some advantages and some disadvantages, yes? One of the disadvantages is subjectivism in the sense you cannot read other people's minds, right? Value is not something you can measure. In economics, we spend our whole life measuring a reflection of value in prices, exchange values, surpluses, anything like that. But value itself, like an emotion, is unmeasurable. It is sort of an appraisal, a subjective appraisal that somebody makes of something. We've known that since 1871. But even more important is you cannot really measure, you cannot really get inside anybody's head and see what it is that they're expecting. You know, so that expectations became very, very important ever since Keynes, and was absorbed into the mainstream in terms of what a probabilistic expectation. But it's not exactly the same thing. Expectations are really different impressions of what people have. So there's sort of subjectivism. Now, that's the disadvantage. There's this impenetrable barrier that we are inevitably imprisoned within the realm of our own minds. And that's why Star Trek is such, and other science fiction explorations is in a way so appealing, because we all crave the intimacy or the ability to connect with soulmates in a way that somehow will relieve us of this inevitable isolation, so that we can somehow sort of share this. And when Spock comes and he can read your mind, right, establishes a connection that in some ways is enviable to us. So in that sense, it is a disadvantage. But this is true if you study any kind of behavior. So if you study the behavior of chimpanzees, or you study the behavior of dogs, or you study the behavior of any sentient being, or any being that even has any kind of a semblance of some kind of process working out towards action, you face this kind of problem. When you study human beings, we have at least the advantage that we are human beings, so that we can empathize with human beings. In other words, the way we study human beings is we assume, we take it as a fact, axiom, that basically we understand ourselves, we understand our own minds, and therefore, I mean by intersubjective introspection, by looking at ourselves and then attributing the same mental processes to other people, assuming that they are like us, we then make assumptions about their behavior. So that was basically the methodology of Ludwig von Mises and the Vienna School in terms of which they approached social science as methodological dualism. What Popper convinced Hayek of was that basically that is a little too narrow. That is true, but there's a broader perspective. Because Hayek, from discussions with Popper, came to the conclusion that while methodological dualism may contain those elements, it was also a matter of the distinction between what we call complex phenomena and simple phenomena. So, quite simply, I have to figure out how to communicate this efficiently, but in a short period of time. Social sciences doesn't proceed on the basis of controlled experiments that yield unambiguous answers. That's the starting point, right? Now, Popper said, well, okay, fine. There are other sciences that don't as well. And why is that? It's because they're complex systems as opposed to simple systems. So, for example, biology is a complex system. Some parts of astronomy even may be, when you have three bodies interacting with one another. This is what Hayek is thinking about already in the 1950s, before we have such things as chaos theory and complexity theory and all these other things, which now all of a sudden become very, very popular. Even the nature of the brain itself. Brain science now, Hayek wrote a book in 1952 called The Sensory Order. It was actually based on work that he did in the 1920s, that modern neurology scientists are, when they read it, absolutely astounded how prescient it was in terms of how he perceives the brain. By the way, it's another reason why he believed that the social sciences were different, because we are in the position of human beings studying the brain of other human beings, and Hayek says, if you want to get a complete or more complete understanding of a system, you can only do it from the vantage point of a system that is more complex than the system that you're studying. That, by the way, is called Cantor's theorem. So we're human beings studying ourselves, right? And all sorts of implications come from that. How much understanding can a brain get of itself or of other people's brains? So he says complex systems are networks or structures where there are many elements, right, that relate to one another in limited but complicated and often numerous multi-level ways. So we're dealing with very complex multiple cause, multiple effect. Hayek writes in 1967 the theory of complex phenomena, and he puts it in a form that most social scientists can understand. He says this is really a problem of too many variables. Too many variables. Because you understand, if you do some basic econometrics, you understand what the phenomenon of interaction is. So you understand if you have two variables that can interact, which leads you to a third variable, the interaction between the two variables. If you assume that there's only one mode of interaction that would be expressed, so you take the product of the two. If you have three variables, the number of interactions now starts to increase exponentially. And if you have 100 variables, you have a very, very, very large number of possible interactions. And if you put it in a hierarchical structure, and you can have interactions both within levels and across levels, you get a system that is basically explosively complex. So complex phenomena is complexity is at one level a practical problem, but at another level is beyond practicality. And again, I don't have time to get into too much into it, but in some computer science, information systems, and mathematics, people are looking at complex systems that are inherently unpredictable. You understand? It's not just saying that they are unpredictable because we don't have enough information and we don't have enough computing power. They're saying they are inherently unpredictable. There's some examples in game theory, for example. There's a game called the Sherlock Holmes Moriarty game, which is inherently unpredictable. Doesn't matter how much information you can gather from it. Given the nature of human beings and the interaction between this is a very simple interaction game, it's not predictable. They don't have closed-end solutions. And there are the life is like that. It's not like the solution to quantitative closed-end problems. So that's in the nature of, very quickly, of complexity. I'm going to go over my time. I'm sorry. Forget about it. I'm going to violate that budget constraint. So complex, in a moment, later on, I'm going to talk about if we are part of a complex system, if we are part of a system that is inherently complex, unpredictable at some level, then how the heck can we act? Right? There seems to be a paradox there. And I'll return to that in a minute. But in order to lead up to that, we have to make a further distinction between complex and simple phenomena. And that is that many complex systems are spontaneously adaptive. What I've already mentioned to you at one time is that they're called complex and adaptive. Complex adaptive systems are complex systems whose multiple interactions lead to outcomes that are in some significant sense ordered or functional. So this is also in the relationship to equilibrium and order. And also bears on the question of values and facts. Because we look at systems and we judge them or characterize them in terms of outcomes that cannot avoid us making sort of certain judgments. But at a very simple level, a system is ordered, as Hayek explains. A system gives order, establishes order, evidences order, if you can know something about the whole system by knowing about the kinds of elements that are in the system and how they interact with each other, and not knowing about the elements of the whole system, right? In other words, you can infer by observing some part of the system, which is typical of the whole system, what the whole system looks like. That's a complex, that means it's ordered. It has adapted into some kind of order. So that, well, last night when I said the distinction between point prediction or quantitative prediction and pattern prediction is that we as human beings, we recognize certain patterns. And I'll give you some examples later on, and you'll see what I mean. But I think we all understand what this notion of order means, right? So you can have complex systems that don't present to our brain, don't present to our perception any kind of order. They appear random or they appear chaotic, right? But complex adaptive systems, we know they're complex. We know they're incredibly complex. We know we cannot understand the details of their workings, but they don't present to us a picture of disorder. They present to us a picture of something that's ordered. We can understand what these mean. They have a certain significance that is shared. Evolution is, in some sense, the most basic of complex adaptive systems. You understand that the idea of evolution comes first from economics and then into biology. Charles Darwin gets these ideas from, I think it was Thomas Malthus. Survival of the fittest is a very crude way of talking about it, but basically it's a system which, there is no deus ex machina. There's nobody directing the thing. What's happening is we've got sort of events that in some class of events that repeat themselves, in which there are random changes, that some of which are more suited to the particular environment in which this is happening, and they get selected out. You're all familiar with this idea. So Hayek begins now, after in the 1930s, speculating about these things. From 1950 to the time that he won the Nobel Prize, he's speculating about sort of how evolutionary systems, selection systems, can lead in the social world to these kinds of ordered outcomes. The brain itself, as I've said, is a complex adaptive system. Think about that. The brain itself, evolutionarily and socially, this is a very fascinating idea. There's this whole debate about nature and nurture and the notion that somehow the genetics becomes imprinted in your brain. Well, Hayek talks about how networks, the social network connections within your brain basically become hardwired as a result of your experience. Not really a biological change, not a physiological change, but a chemicalogical change, if you like, that we have these connections within the brain that are the result of our experiences and our adaptations. And these are transgenerational. This is very provocative stuff. Other kinds of adaptive, complex adaptive systems, language is, think about language, right? clearly language is one of the most remarkable it's impossible. It defies imagination to explain the miracle of language, particularly when you think of how children learn to speak. Because I look at my 7-year-old grandkids, and they speak English, not always perfectly, but better than an adult who's learning English, right? Nobody ever taught them grammar. Nobody ever taught them that the number of the verb has to agree with the number of the noun. They never say, I is. They always say, I am. Nobody ever teaches them things. They could I put together a series of paragraphs now. I would like to think that if you wrote them down, sentences, paragraphs, etc., that if you wrote them down, if you wrote down just a number of sentences that I may put it into a paragraph, now you analyze it. You take it to an English teacher, right? And then they parse it. They show you the structure of the language, right? There's a certain universal logic to the language. Now, who created that structure? And people speaking within language, they don't use that structure. Where did that structure come from? Language is perhaps the most remarkable example of a complex adaptive system, but there are others. Money is one. It's astounding to me, I teach money and banking, astounding to me that I can hardly find a money and banking textbook anywhere, I challenge you to do this, that will explain the origin of money. They all talk about, money is a medium of exchange, it's a store of value, a unit of account, da-da-da-da-da, but no, it's where did money come from? I ask my students, where did money come from? They say government created money. It's another one of those upside down myths, right? There are myths that are just false, and there are myths that are the opposite of the truth. It's not only did government not create money, but actually wherever we've had problems with money, it's been when governments actually monopolized money, which is now the case all around the world. Money is something that evolved naturally, socially, and it tends to be repeated in societies that have nothing to do with one another, that are independent. Other examples are the law. Most of the law, as Hayek points out, if you read his work on law, legislation, and liberty, most of the law that we use, and more so further back than now, is in the nature of law, what we might call common law, evolved law, law that sort of comes out of common practice. People learn to establish solutions to conflicts through some kind of arbitration, some kind of appeal to a particular authority. And those societies that develop these traditions, these norms, these ways of judging things that are impersonal, that apply, where you get the evolution of the rule of law rather than the rule of people, tend to develop in a particular way, and others develop in another way. These are all social institutions, complex adaptive systems. So given that we live in a world of complex adaptive systems, what else is a complex adaptive system? Well, the market is a complex adaptive system, but there are some parts of the market that are open-ended, that don't have a tendency towards equilibrium, if you like. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But how do you make policy? How do you make policy in a complex world? Because the policy maker is living in the same world that we're all living in, and the policy maker faces this unpredictability, or let's say very imperfect predictability at the element level. So this means you're going to have uncertainty in policy prediction. There's no avoiding that. You have uncertainty in two ways. There's uncertainty regarding the efficacy of achieving the intended outcome. Is the policy effective? And there is uncertainty about the unintended consequences. Sometimes you know about these unintended consequences. You know they're going to happen. But frequently you don't. I mean, I think in just about every case of policy implementation, you get consequences that were not only unintended, but unanticipated, and in many cases, unanticipatable. So we call this, in general, causal ambiguity. I do a lot of research in the area of management studies. I'm in a business school. So if Hayek is applied anywhere, it's not in economics, but it's in management studies, in particular in strategic behavior. There's a lot of good work being done in strategic behavior. The trouble is there's a lot of work being done, and most of it is bad. But there's a lot of good work being done because there's such a lot of it. And there is a real attempt to grapple with this problem of causal ambiguity and the nature of knowledge that I spoke to you the other day about the fact that most of our knowledge is tacit, right, rather than explicit knowledge, formulaic knowledge. Most of our knowledge is the sort of knowledge that cannot be communicated. More and more in the kind of complex economy that we live in today, the so-called knowledge economy. So you see how this influences the nature of organizations, of economic organizations. You don't have Ford Motor Company, long line assembly line, massive mass production. Rather, we have smaller, less hierarchical organizations, because there is the question of making decisions that are knowledgeable, that are informed by knowledge. As knowledge is more and more dispersed in an organization, then the principal agent problem becomes more difficult, right? How do you, as a manager, know what to tell a particular worker, maybe a software engineer or something, who knows much more about what he's doing than you know what he's doing? How do you know what to tell him what to do? How do you know to judge what he's doing? And how do you incentivize him? How do you motivate him to do the right thing? So all of these problems of incentive compatibility and so on fall out, really, of Hayek's nature of knowledge and causal ambiguity. Many firms who are successful, if you were sort of to do an intensive interrogation of how they became successful, couldn't tell you. It's like a secret of the trade, but they don't exactly know what it is that they're doing that led to their success. And they talk about this in the management literature, and it's fascinating. So I'm not suggesting that this causal ambiguity is unique to policymakers. Of course not. But the fact is that for policymakers who are in government, the knowledge and incentive problems that are associated with policy implementation do not have the same kind of feedback as they do in the private sector. These governance problems cannot be avoided. But if they're embedded within a system in which there is a feedback that tells you that your adaptation was not functional, right, or your attempted adaptation failed, that system is necessarily going to be more adaptive than a system in which there are no such feedbacks. So in a government policy-making environment, you don't have the same kind of feedback. A business which is struggling with the knowledge problems, with the incentive, for example, do you try to bring the decision-making power to the knowledgeable person, or do you try to get the knowledgeable person to communicate that knowledge to the decision-maker? Because each of them has a problem with it. If you give too much decision-making power to the knowledgeable worker, well, then you have a monitoring problem, right? You have a moral hazard problem. So these kinds of things are considered in the literature, but they're unavoidable. What is true, though, is in a market system where you have some kind of selection going on, if you fail, you get to learn about it. Because how do you get to learn about it? Your profits suffer. That's how you get to learn about it. Because really, the test is, what are you in business for? You're in business trying to transform resources that consumers value. And if they value it, they'll buy it. And if they don't value it, they won't. What does government have that's even remotely comparable to that? So that is the problem of trying to implement policy in a complex world. There is genuine ignorance. So, in that sense, what presumptions should we make about policy? Now let's assume, for example, I will confess readily, we've had lots of interesting, vigorous discussions, right, amongst ourselves about different approaches to policy. You're even surprised to find that there is substantial disagreement about the effects of minimum wages, something else that I thought was well established. So I can tell you, I will confess, that absolutely I don't believe there is a proof that the free market is superior to a command economy. You can't prove this. You can prove Pythagoras' theorem, yes? To a point where somebody who doesn't believe is quite wrong. But is there a proof that it's superior? Yeah, you can show that certain things will result from a free market. You can argue that certain results will result from a free market type system. You can't really prove it, because in the social sciences, the evidence doesn't give you any knockdown proof. Again, we're having a debate about what the Great Depression teaches us. We're not even close to a consensus over this interpretation of this latest Great Recession that's happened. So history doesn't speak to us in one voice. And we have different values. We value things in a different way. I'll speak a little bit more about that. I'll try and go fast. But I will concede that. You can't sort of prove in a very decisive way that this is true and that is not true. Therefore, a lot depends on where you put the burden of proof in determining which policy is going to result. So the issue I want to address with this is what presumptions should we put on policy? What kinds of burdens should we ask the policymaker to bear? And what kinds of burdens should we ask the critic of policymakers to bear? This is a very familiar situation. So shall we adopt a system in which the market is presumed to be efficient? I'm using this word efficient without defining it. There is a definition in economics, and it's close to the way that I'm using it. But for purposes of our discussion, given time constraints, you can think of it as desirable, preferred, something like that. So the market is, shall we say, the market is presumed to lead to desirable outcomes, efficient, so that the policymaker has the burden of proof to show that he or she can make it better? Or shall we say that the market is presumed to be inefficient, and therefore the burden of proof is on the person who is opposing the policy? And this approaches to results in two completely different, what you may call research designs. Because every prescription for action is analogous to the construction of an experimental framework. Every prescription for action or judgment is analogous to a prescription for research, for some kind of research framework. So for example, what I was just talking about, in design A, you would say, if you think you've identified a valid objection to a discretionary policy, then you have to prove it, right? In other words, the policy should be adapted unless you can prove that I'm wrong. The other way, design B, would be that if you think you have identified an effective, justifiable discretionary policy, you have to prove it. In other words, you cannot adopt the policy unless you can prove that it's going to make things better. Now, here's the key. How do you decide between design A and design B, right? Because these two designs reflect differences of opinion about the likely benefits of government intervention. So we're in a research situation. We don't know. We're offering a hypothesis, really. We're saying, do this policy will produce this or that. In other words, we're saying this. We have to make up our mind in the face of incomplete knowledge. And here, the fundamental implication is that absent any simple way to determine these benefits, in other words, the results of the policy and the costs in a complex world, the discussion is likely to reflect more than simply objective facts of the matter. So there's an unavoidable entrance of values into what might otherwise be thought of as an objective situation. Where one puts the burden of proof in this argument is likely to be influenced by one's values. And this suggests that no scientific research, right, is completely value-free if understood in this sense. Now, when I say values, what do I mean? When I say values, I don't mean really in the sense that we do not mostly share fundamental values. I think we all believe that murder is wrong. I think we all believe that we would rather have less poor people. I think we all believe that if we could possibly do so, we should always try to avoid war. These are in the nature of fundamental or nearly fundamental values. In fact, it's impossible to define fundamental values. That's why in economics we use the notion of utility. What is utility? That's what people want. What do people want? Utility. What is utility? What people want. Right? That's what we do. We give it a name. So those in the nature of fundamental values. It reflects their preferences, not only material, but in every way how they value things. Most, if not all of our disagreement comes at another level. Our disagreement comes from what we may call instrumental values. When we disagree about minimum wages, we don't disagree about whether unemployment is good or bad. We disagree about whether or not we should have minimum wages because of what it's going to do to unemployment, or in other respects. So mostly, some of these seem like objective disagreements. I mean, some of these are objective disagreements about facts, but they come in the guise of differences in values, don't they? I mean, we say liberal, conservative, and all that. We rarely think of these people as having different values. But Milton Friedman said this, and I think it was correct, is that really, at the bottom, it's not different values. It's really a different opinion about how the world works. So I have a number of examples that maybe we can talk about in the Q&A, but I'll just run through quickly. Like the quintessential example of bad economic policy as a result of incorrect burden of proof is the Food and Drug Administration in America. I'll just throw it out there. This is what I begin with in my regulation of business class. You all have studied statistics, no? Well, most of you, I guess. So you understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 errors, right? Yeah? Just very simply, type 1 and type 2 errors are not in nature. Type 1 and type 2 errors are the way that we characterize nature, right? So we characterize such a way that we act in an uncertain world. We cannot avoid making errors. Type 1 errors are the errors we most want to avoid. That's the way you set up the research program. That's the way you set up the policy action program. So the FDA, for the FDA, type 1 errors is the error of approving an unsafe drug or food substance. People take thalidomide, it produces horrible birth defects. People take a particular kind of painkiller, it makes them more conducive to heart attacks. That's terrible, because it gets in the newspaper immediately and they're fired. What's a type 2 error? A type 2 error is the error of not making available to people drugs that might benefit them. So an American libertarian TV commentator was at a news conference where the FDA was the suits, right? Suits and ties, standing up there with the CEO of a big drug company, and they were making an announcement. Today, the FDA approved a drug, we're pleased to announce, that will save the lives of 65,000 Americans suffering from heart disease. All of the journalists applauding, asking questions. Right somewhere in the middle of the news conference, John Stossel puts up his hand. He says, let me understand this correctly. Are you saying that if this drug had been approved a year ago, 65,000 people who died would be alive today? That's a type 2 error. Mostly type 2 errors are invisible. Their costs are not as visible as type 1 errors. Why do policy? Clearly, the policies adopted by the FDA commit much too many type 2 errors. Or if I say clearly, at least a large consensus would agree with that. Why? It's obvious to you, right? Because the people implementing the policy are people working for the FDA, and they're going to be held accountable for type 1 errors, not type 2 errors. Now, what about the criminal justice system? The criminal justice system, there are two kinds of errors, right, that you can commit. Burden of proof. So if you arrest somebody in a free society, they are presumed to be innocent unless you can prove them guilty. Nobody is ever proved innocent. You can only prove them not guilty insofar as you don't have enough evidence to prove them guilty. The presumption is with the accused, and the burden is on the state. You understand you get very, very different outcomes if anybody who's arrested is by nature of their arrest assumed to be guilty. Because it's much more difficult to prove your innocence than it is to have somebody else prove your guilt. So the FDA, in a sense, is assuming that every drug is guilty unless proved innocent. And there are many examples of this. Now you can translate this into many different kinds of policies. In fact, it's probably possible to take any policy, minimum wages, union, the effects of unions. I'll tell you why. Because how do you decide where you're going to put the burden of proof? You can't use science. I would suggest you can use one specific fact, and that is that all government policy is by its very nature coercive. If you set up a framework in which we all can have a meaningful discussion, in which you understand common sense terms of force and voluntary action, then government policy is intervention. It's interfering in voluntary arrangements between adult people whom we all agree should be free. Now, we can all agree that sometimes that coercion, that intervention is justified. The question is, how do you know when it's justified, and where should the burden of proof be? Okay, so now my final, very quickly, I'll try and give this very quickly, my final topic is back to that paradox. If, as I say, that action in a complex world, that we're all in a complex world, and complex systems are by their very nature somewhat unpredictable, although we know they may be adaptive, then how can we act, right? If I say that point prediction, say, as a matter of economic policy and as a matter of business policy is impossible, although we can make certain kinds of pattern predictions at the policy level, maybe even at the business industry level, then how is it that we act? Right? Action presumes a connection between cause and effect. Action presumes that behavior is purposeful. In other words, we try and achieve a particular purpose, so we have within the ability to do that. And in an article, Hayek sort of raises this in an article that I published in the 90s. I think I got a link to it. I talk about the nature of equilibrium and Hayekian equilibrium and other concepts of equilibrium. And I think the answer is this, is that when we talk about complex systems and we talk about unpredictability and we talk about expectations not being fulfilled, the whole point about entrepreneurship, why entrepreneurship is necessary, is because the world is complex and we don't know ahead of time really what people want. They don't know. The entrepreneurs try and guess. Most entrepreneurs are wrong. We have the selection process, and therefore we get dynamic adaptation. So we can say that most expectations are wrong in that world, and they need to be wrong if we're going to learn, if we're going to have any kind of social learning. But the truth is, paradoxically, that most of our expectations are fulfilled. Most of our expectations are fulfilled. It's like I planned to be here more or less at 8:30 this morning, right? So did you. And here we are. We basically, everything that anybody does depends upon the actions of other people, everything. So we have a complex interaction. And the miracle of life in a social world, what Hayek called the extended order. In a family, it's more easy to explain. Why? Because the boss of the family, like my wife, she decides what's going to be done, and then everybody takes their orders, like the army. That's a coordinated system, right? But the social system is not coordinated in that way, and yet, most people get where they want to go. Most people do what they want to do. You planned a seminar in a certain way. Certain things come out that you didn't anticipate. But mostly it goes according to plan. So the reason why we can act in a complex world is precisely because most of our expectations are fulfilled. Paradoxically, speculative entrepreneurship, where you can make mistakes, and adaptation and dynamism and innovation is facilitated by the fact that we have social, evolved, adapted, complex social institutions in which we all share the same rules of the game and therefore can orient our actions to each other. Most of these are tacit. We don't understand them. We walk through a door. We don't all try to get through the door at the same time. But we adjust our actions to each other.
You don't know it, right? Yeah.
I knew. Bad example. Bad example, yeah. Well, shall I say in civilized societies? Like America, right? So it's a paradox, but it's not a contradiction, right? let's say, I'll finish off here. We live in a world which is the product of human action, but not of human design. That was a phrase that was coined by Adam Smith's teacher, Adam Ferguson. The result of human action, but not of human design. I would say to you, before you recommend any economic policy, say to yourself, the result of human action, but not of human design. I have a little bit of theory. I'm going to send you a paper about this. A little bit of a theory about how are these social institutions adapted? How do they converge to an equilibrium of expectations? And my answer in a nutshell is, a little bit speculative, is what we call network effects, right? You walk out of a building and there's a lot of snow out there in the mall. There's a pathway here and there's a snow, and you're in a hurry and you walk through the snow to get quickly to where you're going. Somebody comes behind you and they see that you've made a path through the snow. So they walk in your footsteps, literally, pun intended, yes? They walk in your footsteps, and then the third person comes, and each person that walks, it becomes easier to walk as they trample down the path. That's a complex adaptive system. The first person who walked through the snow was an unconscious institutional entrepreneur. He made the path for doing things that turned out to be functional. It's very arbitrary whether we drive on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. But one thing is for sure, we all better drive on the same side, right? So it's because of these things, because paradoxically of this very heightened predictability in which millions of people live together, that we are able to live in a world in which we can adapt, because some part, the commercial sector, the business sector, is adaptively and productively and innovatively unpredictable. So I'll conclude with this. Hayek says, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And I will leave it to you to read this longer paragraph, which is the last paragraph of his Nobel accepted speech when he got awarded the Nobel Prize. Thank you.
You talked about the paradox in which, even though it's very hard to predict things, most of our expectations do get fulfilled.
Yes.
And I was wondering, in that context, Michael Eichenberg talks about how he, as a venture capitalist, he sees 1,000 firms and only invests in 2, because the others will fail miserably. So it seems the other way around. Many more, we don't really, it's like a type 2 and type 1 error. We don't really see failures. We do see very successful firms, but you don't see the business that's shutting down every year or 2. So it seems like there are a lot more mistakes than successes, I think, in a probabilistic way.
Of course there are, yes. I don't remember him saying that, but if he said that, then I don't know if his action is typical of most venture capitalists. Because I remember I had a real job, I told you. I was in a business and in an entrepreneurial venture, and I know how venture capitalists work, and I know that they expect. Okay, this may be another paradox. They expect that most of their investments will fail. So if they make 20 investments, they expect maybe 1 or 2 will be successful. But they don't know which ones. In the Dallas area, of every 20 restaurants that open up, 17 close within 1 year.
That sounds contradictory to what you said.
No.
Maybe the venture capitalists expect it, but I'm sure the 17 restaurant owners didn't expect to get to go bankrupt in a year. Okay, so if they would have expected it, they probably wouldn't have opened a restaurant, right?
Okay, but wait, I don't understand the problem. I'm saying that in that sphere of action, it's very unpredictable. It's like a football game, right? So if somebody commits a violation on the field, right, handball or something, the expectations of everybody as to what will happen will be fulfilled. Everybody understands the rules. They couldn't predict the handball. but they can predict the consequence. They can also predict, everybody knows the rules of the game, but they don't know the outcome. And the only reason why the game is attractive is because you don't know the outcome. But if you were playing the game without the rules, it wouldn't be attractive and you couldn't play it. It wouldn't be peaceful. The analogy is very close. Michael Eisenberg is playing a game within well-defined rules. And most of the plans will fail, but that doesn't mean he goes to war. We know what will happen if they fail. He tries something else. So the event, with the success or failure, is unpredictable. But the way it's dealt with is predictable. And that's why we can live with it being unpredictable. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the use of statistics. Because especially in economics and more and more in other social sciences, we use statistics in order to prove and what do you think is a good tool to deal with complex systems?
Okay, I have to give a short answer. You're all familiar with the black swan, right? Okay, the black swan, Nissan Taleb. Okay, so he's an interesting guy, he's a smart guy, but believe it or not, what he was saying is not new at all. This is the distinction in what I called before qualitative differences and quantitative differences, right? Or categorical differences and differences within categories. When a whole new category of something comes about, there's no way to model that probabilistically. So Mises, for example, talked about case probability and class probability, right? I can say class, I don't have to say class, right? Not Americans. Class probability is a well understood and very useful framework. Insurance companies could not operate without it. It's the basis of diversification in all financial markets. But there's no probability with regard to individual action. With individual action, action is unique. And the individual is unique. You cannot have probability about unique events. At some point or other, there is some connection to relative frequency. Even axiomatic probability work. Even Bayesian. Because you're learning from the basic. Let's put another one. Probability assumes that the events that you are modeling are listable. Further, that you can attach probabilities to the elements of that list. Milton Friedman always said that Knight had it wrong because even if they aren't listable, you know that you can list 9 of them, and there may be others that you can't list, so the 10th is other. Okay, that's a little trick that I don't think works. Because basically when the list is unknown, when the possibilities are unknown, you can't use probability. So this goes to the question of where models work and where they don't. Yeah.
So there's this, if I'm understanding this correctly, what we're saying basically is that even if people don't always understand everything, they eventually somehow operate in a way that's optimal, even without calculating everything. Okay.
Well, optimal in the sense that they couldn't do better. By definition, that's the University of Chicago.
Yes, basically our learning experience teaches us things that we can't actually calculate in a sense.
Yeah, but it's not optimal from the point of view of God.
Oh yes, okay. Okay. So there's an article written by Fowler where he talks about specifically retirement savings. And he says that with behavioral economics and stuff, we always say people aren't rational, and the debate against that is that it says even if we're not rational, we act rationally by experience. And in fields like retirement saving, and I can't think of anything else right now, the claim that he says is that we don't get opportunities to learn because we only save for retirement once, we only retire once, and we can't make any better judgments. In fields like that, don't you feel there's a need to intervene and somehow, paternalistic, God forbid, direct people in it's somewhere where they can make sense of things?
Yes. Maybe. We act in a world where there's let's take a concrete example. Should firms, should the default be opt into the pension fund or opt out of the pension fund?
Exactly.
So these behavioral economists want to pass a law that says the default. Right.
And that's paternalistic, isn't it?
Yes, that's the case for paternalism in that regard. I tell you what, the policy disturbs me less than the attitude. because I think the policy won't do too much harm. I would rather say...
Very good. Enormous good.
Well, so you think. Now you have to prove that. You're interfering in people's private... Can you prove it?
They found it. They showed it. You know, they showed it specifically in organ donors that when you opt into organ donation, 90% of the people donate their organs.
Oh, but you're assuming basically that that's a good thing.
Well, yeah, I do.
All right. Look, so I'm not too concerned about that. Except I don't know why you need a law. Organ donation maybe, but in regard to firms, if you just leave it open, have economists publicize their results. Let them talk about it on TV. Let anybody take out ads, and let people decide what kind of firms they want to work for. If basically there's a lot of benefits to be gained by working for a firm in which the default is opt-in, then those kinds of things will prevail. I wouldn't with a lot of energy oppose that kind of thing, except I would regard it as warranted interference in people's private affairs. I would just so in principle I'm against it. As a matter of the consequences, you can show arguably what are benign or beneficial consequences. I wouldn't be too concerned. What I would be concerned about is, if you think that the principle's okay, then you will go from that to many other types of intervention. That's what worries me. Slippery slope. Yeah.
I would only add a remark to what you already discussed. A solution for that problem, in this particular case of pensions, it has been, I hear the comparison, for example, with health and with doctor. A person does not go to the pharmacy and buy his own drug, but a physician choose the drug for him. And the same thing with pension funds, and that's why you have advisors.
Yes, in the market.
In the market. So you have a market of advice. I mean, you have a market mechanism that can solve that, and it doesn't not to be solved by paternalism, by facilitating that market.
Right.
And the best advisors are the ones who are going to be.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's not a question of regulation or non-regulation. All behavior is regulated. It's a question of where the regulation comes from. The market has spontaneous automatic regulation mechanisms. And the question is, are they worse, better, or the same as the kind of regulations you get from paternalism? And where do you put the burden of proof? The thing about that kind of law that is not so harmful is that it's a general law. It doesn't regard micromanagement. You make it one time, everybody understands it. That's what is attractive about it. If you're going to intervene, you should have a preference for those kinds of interventions. Yeah.
You mentioned the context theory that you can study others' brain only if your brain is more complex. And I'm wondering, there is the new theory. It's not really new, but it's more popular in the recent decades of the wisdom of crowds.
Sorry?
The wisdom
of crowds.
Yeah. So why shouldn't we use it in our economy? Like, why shouldn't we ask the people why they believe or what they think it's going to work for their economy? Like they did it in the salt in the Dead Sea, they did it in the weight of the ox, like so many complex other things that they have no idea about it. So they did a few research that shows that it works in so many fields, like different fields.
Yes.
So if we're saying that everything is so complex and eventually you don't know enough to actually choose right, so why shouldn't we talk about using the wisdom of crowds into the finance, into our economy?
You mean actually embody it in research?
Yeah. Like, let's ask the people what they believe that Israel should do in tax.
Ask people why they believe that minimum wages is a good thing?
Yeah. And the theory
that's not voting?
Not really, because you're voting for one person, you're not voting for each idea or for each subject. Like if you will ask people in Israel about why they believe it should be cancel or not cancel the minimum wage, so in the average you're supposed to get the good answer or the real answer.
Yeah, this is something that maybe we could explore further. I mean, I don't see, the wisdom of crowds, a lot has been written on it. I don't know a whole lot about it. But yeah, we have to make sure that it doesn't just sort of deteriorate into a beauty contest, right? In other words, people just vote for the idea that they like best.
Yeah, but why do they like it?
Why do they like it? Yeah, but I don't know. The point is, okay, just very quickly. The point is, there's no such thing as society in a sense doesn't know anything.
Exactly, and that's why it can feel.
But what I mean to say is knowledge, if it resides in it, the question of where does knowledge reside is like a metaphysical question, right? Because knowledge is subjective. So, but one thing is for sure, that societies don't know things, companies don't know things, it's only individuals that know things. So I would want to know, how do you get closer to the truth, if you like, simply by sort of canvassing large number of individuals who are pooling their subjective perceptions of the world. I could see some arguments. Yeah, so I said, we should explore that further, maybe. That's all I can say. So I want to give some other people a chance. Yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
So you were talking about policy in a complex world, and you mentioned that in the private sector there are less unpredictability and less mistakes because of more feedback and
it's not less unpredictable, but the consequences, there's more feedback, yes.
Okay, so
not there's more feedback, there is feedback.
Okay,
there's almost no feedback in the government. I don't see any feedback. Yeah.
At all. So when you talk about it, the analogy that came to my mind was that in Israel, when you have a big war, a big operation, after the war you have the committee, like the
commission, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, as I see it, there is a feedback. So I mean, what would you say from the private sector to the government? I mean, in your opinion, there is no feedback at all.
In that case, I didn't really think of applying it to war. That is a situation in which everybody is really engaging in a kind of personal research because it is so intimate and so involving. But in most cases, like buying military equipment, the Pentagon buys military procurement. That's the Nobel Prize was awarded to Jean Tirole. A lot of his early work was on the question of how to achieve optimal policy regulation in the context where the government is procuring a contract for some equipment or something, and it's very analogous to subsidies. And he has this advanced analysis of how it trades off certain kinds of equipment. But he has no analysis of the regulator. He has no analysis sort of how you judge the regulator, what the motives of the regulator is, what the regulator knows, the incentive and knowledge problems of that. And so there's really very little feedback because the government is not selling anything. The government is not selling anything. There's no revenue as to compare with costs. We value what the government produces on the basis of the cost of what it costs it in monetary costs, which leaves out some other non-procurement, like the question of the volunteer versus the draft army. So there's no feedback in that sense.
So would you recommend to outsource?
I would recommend to downsize government. To outsource. Outsourcing is okay, but the problem is, again, the regulators are making the decisions. One of the things, when we talk about outsource, we're thinking we're making the government like the private sector. But the problem is we may end up making the company to which it's outsourced like the government. So that you have to keep the government small. Yeah.
You mentioned before that adults can deliver the feeling and knowledge of bad experience to the youngsters. If we look at the following governments in the same way, do you think that following governments have any ability to pass the torch with the knowledge and the wisdom of bad experience, and this way maybe prevent the
mistakes of history? Yes, they may have some ability, but they don't have the incentive. And the people who have the ability are not the people who are likely to get elected. That's the problem of democracy. How can we solve that problem? You tell me.
Athenian democracy.
Athenian democracy.
Randomize the government.
Okay.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, she didn't get a chance. Yes.
I'm just trying to understand a little bit better the Hayek view of knowledge. It's true that the individual worker has more knowledge of the kind of job that he or she does. But the manager also has a different kind of knowledge from having a larger perspective on the ins and outs of the company and all the different people who are working in the company. So it seems like having a broader perspective doesn't always give you less information. Sometimes it gives you actually more information. So in theory, someone could say, if you have a broad view of the whole market, if the government is able to have information, maybe not enough local information, but general information about what's happening, why wouldn't they know things that actually each manager of each company doesn't know?
That's absolutely right. But that's why there's the problem. It's not always a solution to bring the decision-making power to the knowledge worker, because knowledge is heterogeneous, right? Or really, to put it another way, all capital is heterogeneous, including human capital. That again means qualitatively different. They're part of different categories. They cannot be added together. They're incommensurate. So what the manager knows is different in an incommensurate way that cannot be communicated from what the worker knows. And that's one of the problems of management. These are the management dilemmas. That's why there is a need to, that's why we have entrepreneurs, right? That's why you have to have trial and error, because there's not a solution that you can say, well, this is the objective, this is the way you get there, let's solve it, and it's simple. Yeah, exactly. That's how we have management problems. So now you want to say that, okay, so in some respects the government can be like that manager. Did you want to make that connection? So to some extent the government has that broader perspective than would be had by or just within a business organization.
Well, it seems like you could say that government maybe has a kind of knowledge that nobody else in the market has. It could be possible. But then I think what you would say is just let's not let this one kind of knowledge be enforced.
Yeah.
And have power over other kinds of knowledge.
And we should analyze how likely that is. Because what is the competition, the result of which is government? What kind of competition is it? Is it the kind of competition that's likely to produce people who are better able to, who are really, in a sense, more knowledgeable? We always have this model of a ruler who is both benevolent and wise. But the actuality is that those two characteristics are in very short supply among people who actually become leaders. So yes, it's possible.
I don't think you need to make any assumptions about the character of the individuals who are in those positions. I think someone who's the head of the army has information that I don't have, regardless of their character.
No, the character is important in that system because it's a command and control system. In the market, it's not important. Intentions don't matter. But in a government situation where there's no competition for policies, the person who's making the policy has to be well-intentioned. That's what's wrong with it. When you have a system that depends on good intentions, it's much more vulnerable and likely to fail than a system that doesn't depend on good intentions. If we relied on the butcher's good intentions to give us our meat, we would all go home. Okay, thank you.